For decades, the name Vladimir Ilyich Lenin stood apart from his successor. The world called him the philosopher, the thinker, the man of principle, the gentle revolutionary. They said the blood, the fear, the purges, those belonged to Stalin, but history doesn't forgive so easily. The truth is far colder. Stalin didn't create the system of terror. He simply inherited it and perfected the tools that Lenin had already forged. Lenin was the political scientist of cruelty. He built the foundations of absolute power, institutional violence, total central control, and the sacred belief that murder could be justified by ideology. This is the real legacy of Lenin, not freedom, not equality, but the design of a state where fear was law and obedience was survival. His fatal mistake wasn't political, it was moral. He believed his revolution was so pure, so righteous, that any crime committed in its name became holy. And when he handed that belief and that machinery to Stalin, he handed him the keys to total tyranny. The historian Richard Pipes once explained it best. Lenin was the first to use terror systematically and on a mass scale to enforce the rule of the party. He created the doctrine that the state should operate above the law with unlimited power. Without the Cheka, without the ban on opposition, without the use of famine as a political weapon, there is no Stalinism. Stalin was the pupil who surpassed his teacher. But the curriculum was all Lenin's. They taught the world to fear Stalin. But before there was a tyrant, there was a teacher. Before we speak of Stalin's tyranny, we must look back to the man who shaped the very system of fear he would inherit. The first architect of terror, Vladimir Lenin. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 was celebrated as a glorious act of revolution. But what followed revealed a far darker truth. Lenin's loyalty was never to the people. It was to the party. After toppling the fragile provisional government, Lenin faced a choice: to honor the democratic will of the people, or to destroy it. That choice came in the form of the Constituent Assembly, Russia's first truly democratic election. For the first time, millions voted freely for the future of their nation. When the ballots were counted in November 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks had lost. The overwhelming victory went to their rivals, the Socialist Revolutionaries, a party of peasants and reformers. But Lenin did not see defeat. He saw danger. And danger, in his mind, justified everything. In January 1918, the assembly met for the first and last time. Under Lenin's direct orders, Red Guards stormed the chamber, forcing delegates into the cold streets of Petrograd. Democracy in Russia had lasted a single day. Lenin declared that all power belongs to the Soviets, meaning, in truth, that all power belonged to him. This was Lenin's first great political crime: the deliberate murder of Russian democracy. It was the moment he learned that legitimacy could be broken, and once broken, replaced with fear. Every dictatorship has a day when it kills its own truth. This was Lenin's. The historian Orlando Figes, one of the leading voices on the Russian Revolution, describes it bluntly. The crushing of the Constituent Assembly was the critical moment. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. For Lenin, the ends justified the means. and the end was the Bolshevik monopoly on power. From that moment on, all political opposition was redefined as treason, making violence not just permissible, but necessary. With the dissolution of democracy complete, Lenin needed something new, a weapon that could guard his revolution not through justice, but through fear. He couldn't rely on courts or law. They were relics of the old world. What he needed was an institution without conscience, a machine built to destroy opposition before it could speak. In December 1917, Lenin signed the decree that created it, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. A name too long for what it really was. The world would come to know it by one word: the Cheka. Its mission, as defined by its cold, ascetic leader, Felix Dzerzhinsky, sounded simple: to protect the revolution. But in practice, it meant anything and everything. The Cheka was given unlimited power: the right to arrest, imprison, and execute without charge, without trial, without mercy. It operated outside the law because Lenin declared that law itself was a bourgeois illusion. From this point forward, the only justice that mattered was revolutionary justice: swift, secret, and absolute. The Cheka was not a temporary organ of war. It became the beating heart of the new Soviet state, the permanent embodiment of terror. Lenin personally urged its leaders to act decisively, without hesitation. To him, murder was not a moral failure, but a political necessity, a cleansing act to purify the revolution. Within months, its reach spread across Russia like wildfire. Prisons overflowed. Mass graves filled the frozen earth. Every village, every factory, every garrison learned the same lesson: fear is the law now. The historian Vladimir Brovkin, a leading scholar of early Soviet power, summarized its legacy. The Cheka was the direct ancestor of the NKVD, the KGB, and every Soviet secret police that followed. Lenin didn't just permit terror, he institutionalized it. He made fear a routine function of government. This was his greatest invention, and the greatest weapon he left to Stalin. With the Cheka in place, Lenin only needed to give the order. The opportunity came soon enough. In August 1918, an opposition socialist revolutionary attempted to assassinate him. The bullet missed his heart, but it gave him something even more valuable: a perfect pretext for total terror. The response was swift, systematic, and officially sanctioned. By September 1918, the Bolshevik regime formalized the use of state violence. The decree was short, but its reach was limitless. The Red Terror had begun. The targets were vague: enemies of the revolution. In practice, it meant anyone who doubted, hesitated, or merely existed outside the party's favor. Former officials, priests, intellectuals, peasants labeled class enemies. No one was beyond suspicion, and suspicion itself was a death sentence. Lenin's own words reveal a mind utterly detached from human life. He didn't just allow the violence, he demanded it. He urged local committees to increase quotas for executions, transforming murder into a bureaucratic task, a routine part of revolutionary administration. Justice was never the goal. The goal was terror, to teach through fear, to make the population understand that resistance meant extinction. In one of his most chilling directives, Lenin personally wrote to Bolshevik leaders in Penza, ordering the public hanging of at least 100 men as a warning to others. He called for it to be done so that everyone can see, tremble, and know. Murder was no longer a crime of passion. It was a function of the state, centralized, sanctioned, and morally justified by the revolution's leader himself. From that moment, violence became the system. It established the principles that would define Stalin's rule decades later, that the state could kill its citizens at will, and that cruelty was not a flaw in the system. It was proof the system worked. The historian Leszek Kołakowski, one of the most respected scholars on communist ideology, summed up the transformation with chilling clarity. Lenin invented the political terror that justified mass murder through philosophy. He saw the slaughter of opponents as a necessary purification. It was Lenin, not Stalin, who broke with the very foundations of Western civilization. By declaring that morality had no place in politics. Having silenced every political rival, Lenin turned his gaze toward the largest and most vital part of Russia's population, the peasants. The civil war raged across the front lines, but a new and far darker war was declared within. This time, the enemy wasn't the White Army. It was the people who fed the nation. The weapon was a policy called war communism. Its cruel core was the продразверстка, the forcible seizure of all so-called surplus grain. To Lenin, the harvests of millions weren't private property. They were a state asset, a resource to be claimed in the name of revolution. Sound cue, marching boots, distant shouts, wind through empty fields. Armed food detachments, bands of urban workers and Chekists were sent into the villages. They scoured barns, searched homes, and stripped the peasants of everything they grew, leaving just enough to survive. Sometimes not even that. To justify the cruelty, Lenin revived an ancient hatred. He divided the countryside into two camps, the poor and the rich. The latter he branded with a new political curse: Gulag, hoarder, exploiter, enemy. In truth, many of these so-called kulaks were little more than peasants who owned a few more cows than their neighbors. The result was chaos and blood. Villages resisted. The detachments responded with fire. Executions became routine. Entire communities were burned out of existence. This wasn't policy anymore. It was terror by design. A message written in famine and ash the countryside would obey or it would starve. The historian Donald Rayfield, known for his exhaustive work in Soviet archives, described the legacy of this campaign with grim precision. The war on the countryside established the model for Stalin's later collectivization. Lenin created the ideology that the peasant was intrinsically counter-revolutionary. By stripping the grain, he created mass starvation, proving that the party's needs, even if mistaken, were worth millions of lives. The precedent for using famine as a political weapon was set here. This internal war would soon lead to a humanitarian catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, and it proved one fatal truth. Lenin's revolution was built not on the support of the people, but on their suffering. The policy of war communism had done its work. The grain had been taken, the villages stripped bare, and the peasants left with nothing, not even their seed for the next harvest. Then, in 1921, nature delivered its final blow. Drought swept through the Volga region, but it was Lenin's hand, not the weather, that turned hunger into apocalypse. Sound cue: wind howling through empty fields, distant church bells fading. What followed was a human-made disaster. The Volga famine of 1921 to 1922. Entire provinces starved. Parents abandoned children. Corpses filled the roadsides. The death toll climbed toward 5 million souls. And through it all, Lenin watched, not with pity, but with calculation. To him, famine was not failure. It was opportunity. The world saw a starving nation. Lenin saw a political opening. When the American Relief Administration and other groups offered food and medicine, the Bolsheviks reluctantly accepted. But Lenin's real attention was elsewhere. Behind the scenes, he issued a secret directive. The famine, he said, was the perfect cover to destroy his last great institutional rival, the Russian Orthodox Church. He ordered the confiscation of church valuables, gold, silver, icons, ostensibly to feed the hungry. But his private letters told another story. He urged his officials to strike with maximum speed and ruthlessness, to use the chaos and grief of the famine, to crush the church once and for all. Lenin wrote coldly that millions of corpses lying in the streets would ensure no one dared resist. It was the purest expression of Lenin's politics. Human life was not sacred. It was expendable, a resource to be spent in the pursuit of total control. The historian Vladimir Brovkin, a leading scholar of Soviet political repression, explains the meaning of this moment. Lenin viewed mass death not as tragedy, but as tactical advantage. The famine proved the Bolshevik state was willing to let millions die to achieve a political end, whether eliminating the church or breaking the peasants. This cruelty, this cold calculus of loss, became the defining Leninist inheritance, the very logic Stalin would later use to justify the Holodomor. The famine ended, but the lesson endured. Lenin had learned that starvation could serve the revolution, and from that moment on, the Soviet state would never again fear hunger. It would use it. If the famine was Lenin's crime against the people, then Kronstadt was his crime against the revolution itself. The sailors of Kronstadt were not enemies. They were heroes, the pride and glory of the revolution. The very men who had stormed Petrograd in 1917 to secure Lenin's rise to power. But by March 1921, these same men saw what the revolution had become. They watched as peasants starved, as the Cheka executed workers, as the promises of freedom turned into commands whispered in fear. So, they rebelled. Their demands were simple, almost naive. An end to war communism, the abolition of the Cheka's firing squads, and one phrase that terrified Lenin more than any bullet could: Soviets without Bolsheviks. They did not want to destroy the revolution. They wanted to restore it. They believed socialism could exist without tyranny. But for Lenin, that belief was treason. Kronstadt was not a rebellion of enemies. It was a rebellion of believers, and that made it far more dangerous. He saw their defiance as an existential threat, a spark that could ignite a second revolution, this time against the party itself. So Lenin did what he always did when cornered. He chose violence. Across the frozen Gulf of Finland, thousands of Red Army troops marched under the command of Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a brilliant, ruthless officer who would later share the same fate as his victims. The assault began at dawn. Artillery thundered across the ice. The sailors fought bravely, but they were surrounded, outgunned, and betrayed by the state they had built. When the guns fell silent, hundreds were executed on the spot. Thousands more were sent to the new labor camps. The Gulag system that was already spreading like a cancer across the Soviet land. Kronstadt's message was clear. Under Lenin, loyalty meant obedience, not conviction. And any dream of a free Soviet died on that frozen bay. The historian Orlando Figes, whose works on the revolution remain among the most respected, summed up its meaning. The Kronstadt suppression was the final, definitive break between the Bolsheviks and the ideals of the working class. It proved that the Red Terror was not reserved for the bourgeoisie. It was for anyone who dared oppose the party state. The revolution had devoured its own children, all to preserve the personal power of Lenin. Kronstadt was not just a rebellion, it was a funeral. The last moment the revolution still had a conscience. After that, only fear remained. By 1921, Lenin had crushed every enemy that stood before him. The Democrats were dead. The peasants were broken. The loyal sailors of Kronstadt lay beneath the ice. But his final and most devastating act of destruction was not aimed at the enemies outside the revolution. It was aimed within it. At the 10th Party Congress, held in March 1921, just days after Kronstadt's blood had frozen into the sea, Lenin turned his attention to the one institution still capable of opposing him: his own party. There, he introduced a resolution that would forever change the course of Soviet history: the ban on factions. The word sounded harmless, even technical. A measure, he said, to preserve unity during the hardships of war communism. But behind the language of discipline lay something far more sinister. The decree made it illegal for any group within the Communist Party to organize, to debate, or to dissent from the official party line. In one motion, Lenin stripped the party of its soul, its ability to think, to question, to disagree. From that moment, political truth no longer rose from discussion. It descended from the top down as a command. To disagree with the leadership was no longer a matter of ideology. It was treason. To form a group of like-minded comrades was no longer politics. It was conspiracy. And every act of dissent became, by definition, an act against the state itself. This was Lenin's most profound political mistake, and his greatest gift to Stalin. Because once debate was forbidden, there would be no one left who could legally challenge a future tyrant. When Stalin began his rise, no old Bolshevik could stand against him, not because they lacked courage, but because Lenin had outlawed their voice. The historian Leonard Shapiro, renowned for his deep study of Communist Party structures, summed up the enormity of this decision. The ban on factions was the constitutional death warrant of the party's intellectual life. Lenin created a monolith that could move in only one direction, the direction set by its leader. When Stalin inherited the party, he simply took this mechanism and used it to purge every single person who had ever disagreed with him. The ban was the key that locked the door on inter-party democracy forever. Lenin had silenced the world outside the party. Now he silenced the world within it. And in doing so, he made sure that the next tyrant would rule, without ever needing to raise his voice. As Lenin tightened his grip on ideology through the ban on factions, a quieter revolution was unfolding beneath him. A revolution of paper, files, and appointments. While Lenin centralized political power in theory, he unknowingly allowed bureaucratic power to concentrate in practice. And this, more than any speech or decree, would decide the future of the Soviet Union. During the revolution, Lenin had been obsessed with ideology, with purity of doctrine, with action, with victory. He saw the party secretariat, the administrative office that handled day-to-day organization, as a necessary but trivial mechanism. But the secretariat was no mere office. It managed assignments. It distributed information. It decided who entered the party and who was quietly erased. It was the hidden machinery that turned ideology into obedience. And in 1922, when Joseph Stalin was appointed General Secretary, no one, not even Lenin, saw danger in it. The post was considered dull, bureaucratic, unworthy of the revolution's great names like Trotsky. But Stalin saw what no one else did. He saw that the Secretariat was the real engine of power. While Trotsky commanded armies and delivered speeches to roaring crowds, Stalin sat silently behind a desk, signing papers, appointing men. Each new party official, each regional secretary, each local enforcer owed their position not to ideology, but to him. It was the perfect trap. Power that did not proclaim itself authority that moved invisibly through personnel files and sealed envelopes. As Lenin's health began to fail, he lost sight of this creeping transformation. Confined by illness, he waged intellectual battles against Trotsky and his ideological rivals, blind to the bureaucratic coup that was unfolding in the shadows of his own party. The historian E. H. Carr, whose monumental works dissected the birth of the Soviet state, defined this turning point with chilling precision. The Politburo controlled the policy, but the Secretariat controlled the people. Lenin's mistake was structural. He built a centralized party that had to be run by a machine, and he allowed the man who ran the machine to be Stalin. He gifted his successor the weapon of bureaucratic dictatorship. By the time Lenin realized what had happened, the revolution's future was already written, not in manifestos, but in the ledgers and rosters of Stalin's office. The age of the ideologue was ending. The age of the bureaucrat had begun. The Cheka had been the instrument of immediate death. A pistol, a basement, a name crossed from a list. But as the Civil War drew to a close, Lenin faced a new problem. Tens of thousands of prisoners. Men and women who could not be shot all at once, but who could not be freed either. He needed a system, not of mercy, but of management. A way to turn human lives into political and economic utility. The answer was the camp. In 1923, on the frozen islands of the White Sea, the ancient Solovetsky monastery was stripped of its monks and transformed into something entirely new, the Solovetsky Special Purpose Camp, Stalin. It was more than a prison. It was a prototype, the world's first organized network of forced labor under state command. Here, Lenin's vision took physical form. Prisoners were not simply to be executed, they were to be used. Their bodies became state resources, tools to mine, to build, to die productively. The camps were deliberately placed in the most hostile corners of the empire, rich in minerals, starved of mercy. The Arctic, the taiga, the steppe, places where death was slow and entirely invisible to the cities that demanded results. From this foundation, the structure of the Soviet slave system was born. The hierarchies, the guards, the quotas, the bureaucratic coldness of efficiency, all were established here under Lenin. What Stalin later unleashed on a continental scale was not innovation, but expansion. The Gulag was not his creation, it was his inheritance. The historian Anne Applebaum, whose work defines the record of the Soviet labor camps, describes the lineage with haunting clarity. Stalin didn't invent the concentration camp. Lenin did. What Stalin inherited was not just the idea, but the administrative framework, the guards, the command structure, the economic model. Lenin created the fundamental equation. Political opposition equals forced labor and death. Stalin simply multiplied the variables. By the time Lenin's health failed, the machine was complete. The party had its sword, the Cheka. It had its ideology, terror as virtue. And now, it had its factory. The labor camp, where suffering could be measured in output. The architecture of Stalin's tyranny was built brick by brick under Lenin's hand. In May 1922, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin suffered his first serious stroke. It was the beginning of his physical collapse and the quiet, methodical rise of the man who would inherit everything. The lion was dying, and the jackal was already standing guard at the mouth of the cave. Over the next 2 years, Lenin's body failed him. His speech slurred, his movements slowed, and the voice that once commanded revolutions was reduced to whispers and dictated memos from his isolation in Gorky. But what he did not know, what he could not see from his sickbed, was that every letter, every visitor, every scrap of paper that reached him passed through the hands of Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary. Stalin had become the gatekeeper of Lenin's world. He controlled the doctors. He filtered the messages. He decided who could see the dying founder and what words could reach his ears. The same bureaucratic machinery Lenin had built to enforce party discipline was now turned against its creator. By the time Lenin realized it, he was already a prisoner of his own design. He began to see Stalin's nature clearly. The cruelty disguised as discipline, the ambition hidden behind loyalty. The very traits that once made Stalin useful now made him terrifying. The historian Dmitry Volkogonov, drawing from the Soviet archives, described Lenin's final awakening with haunting precision. In his last months, Lenin grasped the colossal nature of his error. He saw that the bureaucratic state he built had been hijacked by a man perfectly suited to exploit its weaknesses. He was a great revolutionary, defeated not by an enemy army, but by a paper-shuffling functionary he had mistakenly placed in the inner sanctum. And so, as Lenin lay paralyzed and silenced, the machinery of power shifted noiselessly around him. The revolution's architect was already being replaced by its engineer. The throne of terror he had constructed was no longer his to command. It was ready for Stalin. By the end of 1922, Vladimir Lenin could barely speak, but his mind was still sharp enough to understand one last truth: that the machine he had built was already slipping from his control. His hands trembled, his speech faltered. The revolution's fire was now trapped inside a failing body. And so, the dying leader reached for his final weapon, his legacy. Between late 1922 and early 1923, Lenin dictated what would become known simply as the Testament. It was not a eulogy to the revolution, but a warning, a desperate attempt to save it from the man he had empowered. In it, he expressed alarm at the enormous power concentrated in the hands of the General Secretary, and he named him directly. Lenin wrote that Joseph Stalin was too rude, that his temper and ambition made him unfit for such authority, and that the party must find a way to remove him before it was too late. This was Lenin's final act of defiance, the one moment when he tried to dismantle the very structure he had designed for total control. But his greatest mistake was not in the warning itself. It was in believing that the party, the machine, would ever act against its own interests. When Lenin died in January 1924, his so-called heirs, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin, met in secret to decide the fate of the Testament. They knew its contents could destroy Stalin, but they also feared that publishing it would hand power to Trotsky, their rival, and the only man capable of challenging the entire system. So they made their fatal choice. They buried the Testament. In that single act of cowardice, they erased the last obstacle between Stalin and absolute power. The men who silenced Lenin's warning would soon be silenced themselves, one by one, in prison cells and execution chambers, built from the very blueprints they had helped create. The historian Robert Service delivers the final judgment. Lenin's final mistake was the belief that his personal morality could somehow contain the monstrous political machine he had engineered. He created the system of violence and then failed to convince anyone to take away the keys. Stalin was the logical, terrible successor to the state that Lenin had built on a foundation of terror and one-party absolutism. Lenin died believing his revolution was unfinished. In truth, it was already complete. A self-sustaining empire of fear, a machine that no longer needed its creator. All it needed was a man ruthless enough to drive it forward. That man was Joseph Stalin, and he never looked back.